You know that old saying, history is written by the victors? Well, today, we're going to put that to the test. We're diving deep into a fascinating and pretty controversial theory that suggests one of the world's greatest epics, the Ramayana, might not be the story we think it is.
So, here's our game plan. We're going to follow the breadcrumbs of this theory, piece by piece. We'll start with the official story, then we'll start poking at some of the cracks in the narrative, search for a motive behind this alleged rewrite, and finish up with a final twist that, well, it might just change the way you look at a map of ancient history. All right, so every good investigation has to start with the official story, right? Before we can talk about a rewrite, we need to get our bearings and understand the established timeline of these ancient and sacred texts. So first thing to realize is that these texts were not written all at once, not even close. We're talking about an evolution over almost 2,000 years. It all starts with the Vedas, which are seen as the oldest, most foundational layer. Then, centuries later, you get the epics, like the Ramayana. And then much, much later, come the Puranas. You really got to keep this timeline in your head because when a text was written is absolutely crucial to understanding why it might have been written. And here's a super important distinction you need to know about. The earliest texts, the Shruti, are considered divine revelation, literally what is heard from the gods. But the later texts, the Smruti, are acknowledged as human compositions, what is remembered. Now, why does this matter? Well, because human compositions can have very human agendas. Okay, so now that we've got the official timeline down, this is where it starts to get really interesting. Because when you start reading these texts less like a follower and more like a detective, the classic good guy/bad guy story starts to unravel. The whole investigation really kicks off with one simple but kind of shocking question. If Ravana is supposed to be this ultimate villain, where are his villainous acts? I mean, the story tells us he's evil, but when you actually comb through the text, you can't find a single unprovoked killing attributed to him. In fact, he's shown as a brilliant scholar and a super devout follower of the god Shiva. And that's the first major crack in the official story. But now, let's flip the coin and look at our hero, Rama. His record is, well, it's a bit more complicated. He does several things that are seriously questionable, even by the warrior code of his own time. And let's not forget the spark that ignites the whole war. It only starts after his brother brutally mutilates Ravana's sister, just because she made a pass at them. This is not exactly the clear-cut good versus evil story we were all told.
Okay, let's put them side by side. On the one hand, our hero, Rama, kills an opponent from behind, a huge no-no in the warrior's code, and something the epic itself seems to have a hard time explaining away. But then you look at Ravana, the villain. His big evil act is a direct retaliation for the brutal mutilation of his sister. It's not random chaos, it's a response.
So right away, the moral lines get incredibly blurry. It seems like the text itself is telling us, hey, it's not as simple as you think. It's hinting that there's a much deeper story going on here.
This leads us to the next big question. If the story was changed, how can we prove it? Well, now we shift from analyzing characters to doing a bit of textual forensics. We're basically investigating a crime scene, a kind of theological heist that happened within the scriptures themselves. Now, to understand the crime, you first have to understand the original law of the land. In the oldest Vedic scriptures, the highest concept of righteousness wasn't a person or a social duty. It was this cosmic principle called Rita, the absolute, unchanging truth and order of the universe.
And right here, this is our smoking gun. In the ancient Rig Veda, the god Varuna is the ultimate keeper of Rita, the supreme judge of everything, bowing to no one. But fast forward to the Ramayana, and this same all-powerful deity is depicted as a terrified subordinate, literally begging the mortal hero Rama for mercy. I mean, talk about a demotion. This single scene feels like a symbol for the overthrow of an entire cosmic order.
And this didn't happen overnight. It was a systematic process, playing out over centuries. First, the very idea of righteousness shifts away from cosmic law and towards social duty. Then, the new top god Vishnu not only takes over Varuna's job, but even adopts his signature blue color. And here's the real kicker. The word Asura, which used to be a title of honor, meaning lord, gets flipped on its head to mean demon, a label then slapped onto all of Vishnu's new enemies.
Everyone knew Ravana was Shiva's #1 fan, his most loyal follower. So why on earth would Shiva just stand by and let his guy get destroyed by Rama? From a religious perspective, it just doesn't add up. The solution? Well, it doesn't show up for centuries in those much later Puranic texts. They introduce a brand new idea, that the monkey god Hanuman is actually an avatar of Shiva himself. Boom. Problem solved. This little patch explains everything. Shiva wasn't missing in action. He was there the whole time, fighting undercover against his own devotee.
Okay, so we've got pretty compelling evidence of a rewrite. But the biggest question of all is why? Why go to all this trouble? The motive, it turns out, might have less to do with religion and more to do with a massive political clash between two ancient worlds. You basically had two competing ideologies on a collision course. On one side, ancient Bharat, with its rigid birth-based hierarchy, the caste system. And on the other, the Sivahela civilization of Lanka, which was apparently a federation where your status came from knowledge and merit, not your bloodline. These two systems are fundamentally opposed.
And here's a massive linguistic clue. The word Rakshasa, which we now translate as demon or monster, comes from the root Raksha. And what does Raksha mean? To protect. The Raksha weren't monsters, they were a tribe of protectors, guardians within that knowledge-based society.
So you can see the playbook, right? It looks like a classic demonization campaign. If you want to conquer a rival civilization whose very existence is an ideological threat, you can't just call it an invasion. You rebrand their guardians as monsters. That way, your conquest becomes a holy war, a righteous crusade. And in the process, the history of that rival civilization is completely erased and replaced with a myth about monsters.
What's really wild is that this method of rewriting history wasn't a one-time thing. This pattern of overwriting an old narrative with a new one seems to pop up elsewhere, especially when you stop looking just at the texts and start looking at the ground beneath your feet.
And that brings us to the core principle for this next part of our investigation. You can edit a scroll, you can change the words, but the physical world, the plants, the climate, that's a witness that can't be corrupted. Let's apply this to the story of the Buddha's birth. The oldest texts, the Pali Canon, describe a lush, tropical setting, warm enough for an open-air birth, with salt trees blooming everywhere. Now, the traditional site in Nepal has a much cooler, harsher climate, but the geography of Sri Lanka? Tropical, consistently warm, with abundant native salt trees. It's a perfect match for the original description. The physical evidence itself points to a different location.
In the pattern of identity theft we saw in the Ramayana, it applies to the gods here too. The guardian deity of Sri Lanka is called Upu Valan. Today, he's worshipped as Vishnu, but there's evidence suggesting he was originally the Vedic god Varuna, the very same god who got demoted in the Ramayana.
The original story follows a clear chain of command. The god Indra is asked to protect the island, so he delegates the job to his peer, his equal, Upalvan, who we think is Varuna. Makes perfect sense. But the later version has Indra bossing around Vishnu, the supreme god of the universe. The logic is totally backward. It suggests that over time the local blue god, Upalvan, was simply absorbed and overwritten by the more dominant, powerful blue god, Vishnu.
So this brings us to the big question. Why? Why go to all this trouble to rewrite a narrative, demote old gods, and patch up plot holes? Well, the theory suggests the motive wasn't just religious, it was deeply political and social. And here's where we get to the core of the motive, a fundamental clash between two completely different ways of organizing a civilization. On one side, in the land of Bharat, you have the growing Varna system, a very rigid birth-based caste system where your job and your status are locked in by your bloodline. But on the other side, in Lanka, the hypothesis suggests a totally different model, a merit-based federation of 4 tribes, or maybe think of them as guilds, who work together based on what they could do, not who their parents were. So if you look at it through this lens, Ravana wasn't a demon, he was a revolutionary. He was a scholar and a warrior, totally smashing the rigid rules of the caste system. He represented a world where what you knew and what you could do mattered more than who you were born as. And to the established birth-based order, a guy like that, he isn't just a rival, he's a monster. This just flips the entire story on its head, doesn't it? It suggests that painting the Raksha tribe as man-eating demons was just really effective propaganda. And here's the kicker. The word Raksha itself literally means protectors. So if you want to justify conquering a prosperous society that represents a dangerous competing idea, you first have to turn its protectors into monsters in your stories. Okay, so the final piece of this whole puzzle suggests that this historical rewrite might be way, way bigger than just characters and gods. It might involve the very ground where history actually happened. Now, this is where the theory gets its most startling and, to be honest, its most controversial. If the authors were willing to rewrite gods and heroes, maybe they were willing to rewrite geography too. This theory proposes that the Buddha's life events may have been essentially copy-pasted from their original locations in Sri Lanka to India. The evidence they point to includes things like geographical descriptions from the old texts that seem to match Sri Lanka better, deep linguistic ties, and the Buddha's constant run-ins with the Yaka people, who are basically minor spirits in India but are one of the founding tribes of Sri Lankan civilization. Now, if there's even a kernel of truth to this, it opens up this mind-blowing possibility of a historical copy-paste. The idea that entire sacred histories, with all their events and figures, were literally moved on the map. And why would you do that? To consolidate all the spiritual, cultural, and political power in your new homeland, and in the process, completely erase the historical importance of your rival.
When you put all of these pieces together, the textual contradictions, the demoted gods, the climate data, what are we actually looking at? It invites us to see history not as a single, clean book, but as something called a palimpsest.
Now, a palimpsest is a really cool idea. It's an old manuscript where the original writing was scraped off so a new text could be written on top. But if you look really closely, under the right light, you can still see faint traces of the original words underneath. It's the perfect metaphor for what we've been talking about.
And that's really the heart of it. This theory suggests that history isn't just the final story we read, it's also in those faint traces of what was erased. The true history includes the stories of the losers, the overwritten gods, and the protectors who were turned into demons. You just have to learn how to read between the lines.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought. If one of the most foundational stories in the world can be reread this way, revealing a hidden history just beneath the surface, what other stories, what other histories that we take for granted are also just palimpsests, waiting for someone to take a closer look?